The Crossing, written by Devil Juice. Have you ever heard about the haunted railroad crossing in San Antonio, Texas? The story behind it generally goes as such. A school bus full of children somehow gets stuck on the tracks. They are not able to get out of the way in time and end up getting hit by an oncoming train. This ends up killing all of the young children on board. It's said that now their spirits haunt that particular crossing. Apparently, if you stop your car on the tracks and put your car in neutral, the spirits of the children will push your car forward and off the tracks. Afterwards, if you take some baby powder or something similar and dust the back of your car for fingerprints, you'll find the little handprints they left behind. Pretty creepy, huh? I first heard about this little haunted attraction when I was a kid. It was the subject of an episode of this TV show I enjoyed, where a group of people would go around and attempt to explain hauntings or other seemingly unexplainable phenomena. The episode that featured this crossing has stuck with me the most out of all of them. This is largely due to the fact that, unlike most shows like this, the investigation had a very clear and succinct conclusion. The first thing the team did was attempt to reproduce the phenomena, and, surprisingly enough, everything happened exactly as described. Their car rolled off the tracks, seemingly on its own, and they did end up finding prints on the back of their vehicle. However, the most interesting part of this episode is how, after seemingly having proven that the phenomena was real, they then proceeded immediately with debunking it. They had a land surveyor come out and inspect the area, and he found that, even though the surrounding area appeared to be completely flat to the naked eye, it was actually at an incline. The team then consulted a fingerprint specialist, who surmised that the fingerprints they had found on the back of the car were more than likely simply old ones from all the times that someone had touched the back of the vehicle. This, alongside the fact that they weren't able to find any record of the described bus accident actually occurring, ended up completely disproving the haunting. I can't for the life of me remember what any of the other episodes were about, or even the name of the show for that matter, but that railroad crossing always lingered in the back of my mind. I always had an interest in this sort of thing, and even though I knew it was fake, I still wanted to check it out sometime, just for fun. I finally got the chance about a couple of months ago when my wife and I had to travel down to that area of Texas for my sister-in-law's wedding. Once I knew we'd be in that area, I immediately decided it was a perfect opportunity to have a little fun with my wife. Unlike me, she was never a big fan of horror, and trying to spook her every now and then is one of my favorite pastimes. I do feel like a bit of a dick about it sometimes, but it really is all in good fun. She has her own ways of getting back at me, and besides, it's far too funny to give up. Over the years, she's gotten wise to my usual methods, and it's not as easy to spook her now. However, the added challenge just makes it more fun. The railroad crossing was perfect in this regard, seeing as I really didn't have to do anything to get something spooky to happen. It was perfect. It took some convincing, but I was eventually able to get her to agree to go check it out with me one night. I could tell she suspected I was up to something, but she didn't push it. I didn't need to fake interest and excitement, as it was something I had long wanted to check out anyway. I told her why I knew about it, minus the debunking part, and I suppose she decided I was being genuine. As we made our way out there, I told her more about the backstory of the haunting to set the mood. She scoffed a bit, calling the whole thing a tad bit cliché, but I could tell that she wasn't entirely unaffected. Clouds obscured the moon almost completely, and the headlights of my car almost seemed to be the only man-made light in sight for miles around. There was the occasional street light, but either due to the power outage or simply poor maintenance, none of them seemed to be working properly. Eventually, we reached the crossing. It looked rather normal, if perhaps a bit old. I did my best to hide my eagerness as I parked our car directly on top of the tracks and turned off the engine and headlights. We weren't cast into complete darkness though, as there was finally a functioning streetlight some distance ahead of us on the opposite side of the tracks. My wife chuckled a bit, commenting on how mundane the crossing was. I simply smiled to myself, knowing that she would likely change her tune soon. I had been looking at her, but my gaze quickly snapped back to the front of the car when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Whatever it had been was gone when I looked, but I could have sworn I'd seen a figure of some sort passing underneath the streetlight. I simply shrugged it off. It was probably nothing but an animal. Perhaps I even imagined it. With a subdued chuckle of my own, I put the car into neutral. We sat there in silence for a few moments, simply waiting. My wife was about to say something, but quickly swallowed her words. As expected, the car started to move at a slow crawl, rolling off the tracks seemingly on its own. My wife chuckled nervously. She looked over to me, asking in an incredulous, slightly shaky voice how I was managing to do this. I didn't respond though, staring blankly ahead. She shook my arm to get my attention, and I finally looked over at her. I could see the confusion and unease in my expression reflected in her eyes. I only just barely managed to utter these few words. "We're going the wrong way." Even as I spoke, the car was continuing to roll backwards at a slowly increasing speed. It almost seemed as if we were rolling too fast, even if we had been going the right way down the slightly sloped ground. I found my gaze drawn back to the solitary streetlight in front of us, its gentle light receding into the distance as we traveled backwards into the inky black behind us. I started to panic. I tried to hit the brakes, but the pedal wouldn't do anything, almost as if my brake lines were cut. Turning the keys in the ignition wouldn't elicit anything from the engine other than a sputter. I struggled with the door, trying to get it open, but the lock wouldn't budge. We were trapped, helpless. I looked back up towards the streetlight, but that solitary light in the darkness was simply gone. That couldn't be right, though. We hadn't traveled backwards far enough or rounded any corners that would have made the streetlight fall out of sight. It should have been there. It was then that a thought occurred to me. A thought that I in no way wanted to entertain, yet clung stubbornly to my mind all the same. It wasn't that the streetlight had disappeared or anything like that. Something was blocking it from view. The car tilted forward slightly, the front shocks depressing as if something heavy was forcing the front end of my car downwards. Even though this unknown weight was only a few feet in front of us, it was far too dark to make anything out. The car was still speeding up as well. With the engine off, I had no way of reading the digital speedometer to tell exactly how fast, but it felt like at least 50 miles per hour at this point. Far too fast. We were traveling backwards down a pitch-black country road with no control over our vehicle, at a speed that could easily be deadly. My wife and I clung to each other, terrified. I kept slamming my foot down on the brake pedal over and over, hoping beyond hope that it would eventually work. My vision started to adjust to the darkness somewhat, if only slightly. My eyes, stretched wide with fear, were finally able to make something out in the darkness. I could only just barely make out the shape of it. It was large, far larger than I would have ever expected. The car was going even faster. I saw the glint of eyes, beady and black. The car went faster and faster. I saw a mouth full of clenched teeth, the mouth too wide and the teeth far too long. The car went faster and faster, and then the car screeched to a halt as I slammed on the brakes one last time. Whatever had kept them from working previously was simply gone. Breathing heavily, I slammed the stick into park with more than a little too much force. My wife and I simply looked at each other, wide-eyed and fearful, neither of us seemingly able to speak a word. Not that I could think of anything to say anyway. Before we even had a chance to try to compose ourselves, there was a massive roar from above that shook the car like an earthquake. It was not the organic roar of a beast, though, but something more artificial in nature. I was immediately reminded of a war movie that I'd seen recently, as something massive tore through the sky above us. It passed us, and there was a brief moment of relative peace. It didn't last long, though, as it was followed quickly by a terrible cacophony of sound. A massive impact and rumbling. The sound of an incredible amount of earth being scooped up, trees being torn from the ground by their roots, metal screeching as it bent, tore and crumbled, all happening at once and barely distinguishable from each other. An intense assault on the ears. Eventually, though, after a time that felt like forever, the chaotic sound ceased. My wife and I released our hands from where they had clutched fruitlessly at our ears. We glanced hesitantly at each other, wondering if it was finally over. A few moments passed, but nothing else happened. We looked at each other and gave each other a brief nod, coming to an agreement without words. I turned the key in the ignition, barely able to hear the sound of the engine starting up over the ringing in my ears. I hesitated, but eventually flicked on the headlights. I breathed a sigh of relief, as there was no trace of whatever had been pushing the car, if there had been anything there to begin with. I put the car into gear and started to drive. We didn't have to go far. Our journey backwards may have felt like an eternity at the time, but it could have only lasted a couple of minutes at most. Soon enough, we found ourselves back at the railroad crossing, or rather, what was left of it. We stopped the car, my wife and I both getting out to look on in shock and awe at the crash site of a large passenger jet. The impact had obliterated most everything on the opposite side of the tracks from us, leaving it a smoldering crater. I found myself wondering what would have happened to us if we had rolled forward as intended. The thought alone made me nauseous. My wife walked forward a bit to get a closer look. I trailed a bit behind, though, preoccupied with my thoughts. Was this crash and what had happened earlier connected in some way? Were we intentionally being pushed out of the way of this crash? That was impossible, though. Everything about the crossing was simply made up. It was simply a bit of sloped ground and nothing more, wasn't it? As I thought about all this, my gaze was naturally drawn towards the front end of my car. It was then that I saw them. A pair of handprints. I didn't need baby powder to be able to see these handprints, though, as they had left behind a black, soot-like residue all on their own. The prints were large and strangely misshapen, the palms being around 6 inches wide and each finger stretching out nearly 1.5 feet in length. They alone were more than enough to deeply unsettle me, but the carefully scrawled words, written in the same residue just above the handprints, terrified me to my very core. I hastily wiped it all away with my sleeve, not wanting my wife to see the message our apparent savior had left behind. You owe me one. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you want to help support me, please check out my merch store so I can continue making these narrations. Have a good night, everyone. Love, the Mistress.